Hey everybody, so I know everyone wants me to talk about the recent development of Chris Chan's charges getting dismissed, and that's certainly worthy of discussion, but I want to put a little bit of space between my Chris Chan videos, even when there's rapidly unfolding news in that area. Not too long ago, I did a live stream from here, and I had a lot of fun with it. I'd like to do more of those. But somebody asked what the worst book I've ever read was. And I answered, but there's actually three worst books in order that are the worst books I've ever read. And I want to share them with you, and I want to share them with you because today we were the movers and I were getting the last of the major stuff from my old apartment. So I've got my couch and my TV entertainment center and everything, and all of that, and so I've got the last of my big stuff. But anyway, they moved. They moved a shelf and found and unearthed one of the worst books I've ever read, and you can tell it's just been kept in wonderful condition. So anyway, these are three books that, without exception, and I don't want to be one of these channels that where they just things like the guys that just go watch everything that Tommy Wiseau does and everything that Neil Breen does and all these incompetent creators and everything, and the who's the guy that wrote Norman Boutin, who wrote Empress Teresa. Things like that. I don't want to just be one of these people that goes to laugh and gawk at these things. And yes, I know Empress Teresa is a horrible novel. I tried to read it, could not get very far into it. It would be on this list if I had read it, but it was so bad that I couldn't read it. Anyway, so I don't want to be one of those things that just picks on people. People all the time try to do try to do things that they're not suited to accomplish, or start out on a career of doing something and give up on it, so they just have this one bad first attempt and that kind of thing. And so there's a certain amount of slack also because, being a writer myself, I know the process of writing and everything that is involved in that, and that no matter what you have written, you really do have to pull it out of you with some blood, sweat, and tears. And so I'm always a little sympathetic to that. So this is not, even though there are going to be things that are totally awful and lame and ridiculous and bad in these books, this is not just trying to stomp on people's feelings for the sake of being mean. Hopefully I can shed some light and give some perspective on good writing and versus bad writing with this, and do some constructive discussion and that sort of thing. So anyway, the three worst novels I've ever read, starting with novel number 3, is Dreamsaver by Michelle Ismailoff. Now, first of all, a little bit of backstory. One day I was driving through Roswell, Georgia. I lived in Roswell, Georgia for a number of years when I was a kid, but this was as an adult. And I stopped by, just saw this, it was either a Goodwill or Salvation Army antique store. And I love to go into these places and look in the bookshelf, the book section, because 9 times out of 10, what do people donate to charity? What books do people donate to charity? Well, it's usually the most mainstream mass market fiction, so a lot of Danielle Steele, John Grisham, Stephen King, that kind of thing. But once in a while, you will find these things that are so weird and obscure and odd that they're just treasures of just as oddities, and this is the best of those. this book, okay. So this book was written, this book, when you read it, it's going to sound like it was written by a 12-year-old girl, because it was. Michelle Ismailoff was this junior, at the time, I did a little research into who she is. She was this junior high school kid who won some kind of writing contest, and the prize, it says on the top of the book, award-winning author. The award they're referring to is she won some kind of writing contest with this novel thing that she'd written, and it got published as a novel, and it's just utterly fascinating to try, to in a very weird way, because it's basically throwing every cliche of YA fiction into a big cauldron, into a big blender, and just hitting frappe. Basically, it's just, how do I mix all these things together? The plot deals with some spirit, some mystical jewelry, and we go back and forth in time between present day and the age of the Black Death, the time of the Black Plague, and all of that, the Black Death, bubonic plague, and all of that. And it's not only is the plot very wafer thin and not very interesting, it's written, it feels like, again, you have to cut it a certain amount of slack, because this was written by a 12-year-old girl. And I want to emphasize that, because that, unlike these other two that were written by coherent, supposedly functioning adults that are supposed to know better, this was written by a 12-year-old girl. It was published when she was 13, so I'm assuming she was 12 when in the writing process. And it just trips over everything that you would want in good, coherent writing. It'd be one thing if we were reading the work of some kind of child prodigy that had written some incredible adult level fiction at 12 or 13, but this is absolutely not it. To give you an idea, like, there's one character that's an old man who has a tree in his on his property that is having to be uprooted, and every single time we see this guy, he's thinking about how much he misses his tree and considers it a friend. And we're hearing this as if we're hearing it the first time. And that's probably because, this was probably written in, different, not structured to any coherent outline. It was just written, kind of all willy-nilly in little spurts and starts and stops. And we feel like the book is kind of constantly starting and stopping over and over again. But then on top of that, it's interesting, because she's a kid, because she's a young teenager or a young adolescent when she's writing this, she focuses in on things that are totally unimportant to the story. For example, there's an entire chapter devoted to the main character, who is a very obvious self-insert for Michelle Ismailoff. There is a whole chapter devoted to her sidekick is an older teenage boy who has a car. And there's a whole chapter devoted to her getting permission from her parents to go get in that car with the teenage boy and go riding somewhere they need to go for the sake of the story. And it's funny, it's like, this is totally unimportant, unnecessary crap. If you needed to touch on it at all, for the sake of, there is some legitimate realism in terms of, would parents allow a girl, a young teenage girl, to go riding in a car with an older boy like that? But if you need to touch on it at all, you can do it in 2 or 3 sentences. I mean, it's not a complicated thing, but it's just treated like it's the most important thing in the world. And the reason for that, I realized as I was reading it, the reason for that is, if you are a 12-year-old girl, getting to ride in a car with a cute older boy is like the most important thing on the planet. That's the most important thing ever. So it's things that don't matter are given additional weight, tremendous weight. And then also, adding to the fact that it's a self-insert character, very much an author on board main character. The main character within the story is a best-selling young adult author who is in high school, and all of her classmates talk about how cool it is that they have a best-selling author in their midst and everything. And this is very much, I think, adolescent wish fulfillment on the part of Michelle Ismailoff, because in reality, if you're some kind of child star or something like that, usually either you're homeschooled altogether, or you're not in public school at all, or if you are, you have to keep that very quiet. It's kind of like Natalie Portman, and I know this because I was obsessed with Natalie Portman as a teenager. Natalie Portman was acting in movies when she was 10, 11, or 11, 12, 13, 14, I believe 15 when they shot Phantom Menace and all of that. And her friends that knew her in high school would tell you that if you did not know who she was, if you just knew her from school, you would not think there was anything celebrity about her at all. Like, she didn't talk about it, she didn't say anything about it, she didn't draw attention to herself, Portman is not even her real name, that kind of thing. And that's intentionally so, because in reality, if you're some kind of child celebrity, either the kids are going to be wildly obsessed with you, or they're going to be scornful and mean to you. And so this very naive idea that everyone thinks it's so cool and they have this very balanced and healthy admiration for is just totally unrealistic. Also, the book within the book that the self-insert main character is the author of, that she has totally unrelated to the plot things about going on doing an autograph in-store book reading autograph party. This is just, again, wish fulfillment stuff for Michelle Ismailoff. But it is the book that she's promoting within the book is a book that Michelle Ismailoff herself later wrote and published. And I could go on harping at length about everything that's wrong with this book, but really I want to offer some specific, I want to end with a compliment to Michelle Ismailoff, but I want to offer some constructive criticism, which is, the thing is, it is great. It is really great that this kid wrote this book and wrote an entire book and fleshed out. It's great that she had, at 12, 13 years old, the determination and the patience and the focus necessary to create an entire book, a novel-length story from beginning to end. That's great. It should not have been published. And I'll tell you something. When I was about that age, being a precocious, young, aspiring writer, I wrote a novel too. And I'm sure if I went and dug it up, it would have about this level of literary quality to it. Because what you're seeing there is the burgeoning skill of someone, the raw material that could be shaped and molded into something better. But rather, we're just taking this what should be an early artifact of a writer that doesn't actually attain publication until her 20s or 30s. We're taking this early artifact and presenting it like it's something brilliant. And literally, we have things like quotes from reviews on the back flap of things like that say, "Move over, Harry Potter. Michelle Ismailoff is the next J.K. Rowling," and that's from Rosemary Taylor from Review and News. Well, she's definitely not. But the thing is, rather than just finding ourselves in an Emperor Has No Clothes situation by pushing ourselves all the way to trying to push this into notoriety when it shouldn't be, when it's not worthy of notoriety. What happens is it creates a very stunted writer in Michelle Ismailoff. Because I was curious, and so I went on Amazon and started looking at her other writing, just the free samples online of her other books, and they're all at about this level of literary quality. From what I could tell, the writing style, the quality of the prose, the things like there was one book that was, I think, set in like World War II era or something, and the main character, the narrator, the first person narrator, talks about taking a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and how much she likes wrapping her hands around a cup of warmness. Well, first of all, that's grammatically incorrect, and secondly, that's not how people in that era would have talked, that kind of thing. They would not have used modern day youth vernacular like that and stuff. And what happens is, rather than say, you're a talented young writer. Let's go through with a red pen and have a sober discussion about everything wrong with this book so that you can either clean it up and make it better, or start afresh with something new. Have that tough conversation with her. They took this not even first draft quality book, published it, and I think gave her this idea that she was some kind of literary event or something like that. And she went on to write several more books that are really not any better than that. Now, I do want to close with something. After I got, I have to tell kind of a funny story quickly about this. When I was in that Goodwill, I just noticed this book and I left, and I just kept thinking about it. I thought, I have to go read that book. I have to get that book. It just seems like such a little oddity. I've got to have it. So like a couple weeks later, I came back and got the book from the store. I took it up to the counter and just handed it to the woman behind the counter, and she looked at it and said, "I'm not opening the till up just for that. You can just have it." So I got this book for free. But anyway, I want to say something kind about Michelle Ismailoff. She is now a fully grown adult, I believe, in her early 30s, and she is a doctor, a hospital doctor, and was a first-line medical responder during the COVID epidemic, and I'm not going to say where she works, but she was saving lives and helping very, very sick people during the pandemic, and really doing a lot of good in the world. And that is a noble and heroic endeavor, and she certainly contributed a lot more to the world than I did during the pandemic. So good for her on that. I can't say anything good about her literary career, but I do respect her for doing that, and I do appreciate that she did that. And I want to acknowledge that. All right. The second worst novel I've ever read was A Good and Happy Child by Justin Evans. So this book starts with an interesting premise. It begins with the idea about this man who is having, he cannot hold his newborn baby without having basically what seem like horrible anxiety, panic attacks. And so he enters therapy and starts going back into his childhood for that. This is certainly a worthwhile premise for a story. It's an interesting idea. It drew me into it. But I will tell you, it says, like in the back says, in the smart and suspenseful A Good and Happy Child, a psychological thriller in the tradition of Donna Tartt's The Secret History with shades of The Exorcist, a young man re-examines his childhood memories of strange visions and erratic behavior to answer disturbing questions that continue to haunt him and his new family. And it goes on, some of the reviews say, think Rosemary's Baby Plus, told in the kind of prose that mesmerizes, sweeping the reader along so fast that there's no time to ask questions. And, and another one mentions The Exorcist again. Whenever you have a book that is trying really, really, really hard to endear itself to the audiences of specific books, trying to draw you in by putting you in the mindset of books you already enjoyed like that, it's never a good sign, because it's usually gonna mean that the book cannot stand on its own. That it cannot stand on its own merits, and it's even more. It's an even more tenuous claim when you're talking about things like certainly The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby. These are major creative works, highly regarded creative works, and then it goes all the way into Donna Tartt, who's a literary, upper echelon literary master. Trying to launch yourself into that category is never a good sign, and while I've never read all of Donna Tartt's promotional materials, I've certainly never seen her books advertised that way. They can stand on their own. Anyway, so the book, fundamentally, and I will read you one quick passage that explains exactly what I'm talking about. Anytime you're going to be doing one of these things where we bounce back and forth between adult and child eras of one person, and I can say this with some authority because one of the manuscripts I'm working on right now also deals with an adult confronting childhood memories in a different context, but it's still the same literary device. Whenever we're dealing with something like that, you have everything that you bring up in the childhood era has got to pay off in the adult era. There's got to be a payoff building up, because there has to be. He's not reminiscing about his past for nothing. It's not like, say, Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, where it starts off as a man reminiscing about his past, because it is just a coming of age novel about him looking back on this time in his life, and who he is as an adult is only a bookend to the actual story. It's not like that here. If we're going back and forth, and we're like gradually supposed to be putting the pieces together as we go, everything's got to pay off. Everything's got to be set up properly, and it's got to pay off properly. And I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, I want you to take a notice of how far in the book this passage I'm about to read is. We are in the final pages of the novel here. We are in the final pages of Act 3 of the closing act of this novel. Things are supposed to be wrapping up at this point, moving towards the climax. Okay, I'm going to read you a specific paragraph and then tell you what's wrong with it. I learned about, quote, he begins speaking to somebody, quote, I learned about my father from those guys, things I never knew. My father had visions. He wrote a book so brave and difficult that people turned on him. As for me, listening to them talk, it's like I'm hearing about this great person. They looked up to him. They talk about him like I talk about Steve Garvey, close quote. Then in the narration he says, don't ask me why, but I was a Los Angeles Dodgers fan and owned a shoebox full of little cardboard Steve Garveys. Okay. This is why I emphasized how late in the book this was coming, because for this entire book that has been built around setting up the person that this guy was when he was a child, then by setting that up, this entire book has been spent setting up who this guy was as a child to build up to the ending, to build up to the very end. This is, by the way, why you don't want to compare yourself to a literary titan like Donna Tartt, because you're really going to put your foot in your mouth. But anyway, this thing comes right at the end, almost at the end of the book. Throughout this book, he has said absolutely nothing about Steve Garvey, nothing about baseball, and says they talk about him like I talk about Steve Garvey. He's never talked about Steve Garvey in this whole book. So this major revelation that he's having about his father and tying it into himself is coming up apropos of nothing. And it just reeks of self-indulgent first novel, first draft level writing. And this book was, unlike Dreamsaver, this book was majorly marketed in Barnes and Nobles and other major big box bookstores and all throughout the literary world when it came out. Of course, it vanished without a trace, but it was set up to be a major literary event. They were really pushing this book, and it's this unbelievably just first draft level nonsense. You just are left thinking, did no editor ever say, hey, you can't just you can't just in the last pages of the book make the guy that said absolutely nothing about baseball into an obsessed baseball fan. That has to be set up earlier in the book. It has to be, if he's talking about Steve Garvey all the time, then we need to hear, if he's been talking about Steve Garvey all the time and we need to reference that for the sake of the plot, then we need to hear him talking about Steve Garvey in the book. It's kind of like, I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. It's kind of like if you've seen the movie Signs, you know that, one of the theme of Signs is everything happens for a reason. That's the M. Night Shyamalan movie Signs. You know that everything happens for a reason. And so things like the kid keeps leaving half-empty glasses of water everywhere because he's got weird OCD tendencies and whatnot. and that seems annoying and unnecessary until they're confronted with an alien at the end that's vulnerable to water, and lo and behold, they've got all these little half drunk glasses of water they can grab and throw at him and everything. So everything happens for a reason. It supports the theme throughout. That would not work if you just had him randomly set up a bunch of glasses of water all over the house in the third act of the book. No, it's got to set up, the movie, it's got to set up and work and flow throughout. I did a little research back when I first read this. I did a little research, and this guy, it even says so in his bio, this Justin Evans guy is some kind of high-powered New York business executive. And apparently, I don't know how true this is, but it seems likely. Apparently, he got this published because he just, like, being a high-powered New York business executive, he knew a lot of people and could pull a lot of strings. And so got his crappy first draft amateur novel published as a major literary event just by, scratching backs and, pulling strings and that kind of thing. All right. The worst novel I have ever read in my life, bar none. Lives of the Monster Dogs by Kirsten Backus. The quizzical look on this dog's face on the cover is pretty much the quizzical look that will be on your face the entire time you are reading this. So, the idea is these dogs that have been modified in some way so as to have a human capacity. They've undergone some sort of mysterious surgical process to have human thinking, cognitive capacities, and the human capacity for communication, and have been modified in certain ways so that they can walk upright, and talk and kind of and be humanized in certain ways with these mechanical attachments and everything like that. And they arrive in New York City, and the book is told through the perspective of the young woman who is tasked with interviewing them and kind of becomes their press liaison. And it's one of these things where she sets up one thing, she sets up a premise that is, first of all, completely not reasonably supported by the unfolding events of the story. And what I mean is her explanation that, they come to New York City and the dogs become the dogs, they have mysteriously have large amounts of wealth and that sort of thing. And they ingratiate themselves to the New York elite, and they become these big socialites and the talk of the town in New York social circles and everything. And her explanation for that basically amounts to that, well, New Yorkers are just a little more with it than everybody, so they're able to go along with it when everybody else, people in the rest of the country can't. But New York is just a little bit of a cut above. Yeah, fuck you, lady. Anyway, but not terribly realistic. The human mind, in a more realistic context, the human mind is going to balk at something that is that uncanny. If you actually go look at, there's a great movie called Antichrist, one of my favorite movies by Lars von Trier, Antichrist, and there is a scene where a realistic, what we have been interpreting as a real fox, like an actual red fox running through the woods that's been showing up throughout the movie, looks at the main character and he says, "Chaos reigns." And it is so unsettling and so bone-chilling and so weird and so just so uncanny and uncomfortable. If you go watch the David Lynch movie Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me, there's a scene where a monkey appears to say something, and it's just a monkey, that suddenly says one human word, and it's so jarring and so weird. And that's the thing that you have to stop and think. Something that bizarre as a dog that's able to talk, if you actually saw that, if you actually encountered that, it would just stop you, like it would you would be probably terrified, confused, just completely sensory overloaded by that. And that's the thing, is if we are getting into this thing that it's hard to say what kind of book this even is. Is it fantasy? Is it science fiction? Is it horror? It's obviously it's got to be some kind of it's not literary fiction, we know that. But as far as what genre it is, it's got to be, either if you want something that weird to be like an afterthought that everybody says, oh, that's cute, and goes on with their lives, you've got to have a world around it, built around it, that's like something like Futurama, where every single character is so weird and bizarre that people just don't even notice it. But something that bizarre would not be, you would not be able to settle that with, oh yeah, New Yorkers are just a little bit better than, a little bit more with it, a little bit more cooler than everybody else. So we can deal with something like Crossing the Uncanny Valley like it's nothing. So there's that. And then the fact, everything she sets up. First of all, the main character sounds like a ditzy 20-year-old girl, a ditzy girl in her early 20s. Fair enough, that's what she is. The problem is every single other character in the story sounds like that too. And it feels like, the thing is now, with this and with Good and Happy Child, I read both of these when I was in college. This was 20 years ago. So I could go do a much, much more in-depth analysis of each of those books. I don't really care to, because I don't want to put myself through reading them again. But we have things like the dogs are, as the dog characters start, their plot threads start to unfold, unravel really in the book. One of the things that they encounter is that all of these medical treatments they've had are starting to come undone. They're starting to revert back, they're starting to revert to their old ways and just act like dogs again rather than human beings. And they're worried what's happening to us, the existential crisis of it all, the treatments that made us geniuses are wearing off. Well, that's really just cribbed from Flowers for Algernon. The concept in general is just cribbed from Frankenstein. And I read an interview with Kirsten Bacchus, the author, where she said, someone asked her to describe the premise, and she really did say something like, well, I guess it's like Frankenstein for dogs. Again, if the best you can do is kind of prop your book up on the strength of more long-standing literary accomplishments, you don't really have a story. I mean, you don't really have an engaging story, I should say. And also, when you're talking about your writing, you should never answer a question with, well, I guess. You should know. But anyway, it goes on. And again, it's another thing of like zeroing in on unimportant, nonsensical minutia that doesn't matter. Like I remember there's a conversation, a very protracted, ongoing conversation where three characters are talking about what kind of dessert they want to have, and they all settle on having cake. And it's this long, drawn-out conversation trying to work out what they're going to do. And I thought, okay, well, this has to be setting something up. This has to be a setup for something. Like, there has to be a payoff. Otherwise, this is just inane drivel. And yeah, it was just inane drivel. Without giving too much about the plot away, there's this weird, basically she starts relying on these Hollywood cliches, relying on things that would only really pay off if you were watching a big budget summer blockbuster Hollywood movie. They would work better there, but they don't really work in a literary context. And for example, one of them is that the dogs have this lavish home that they live in, and they've been building up a stockpile of weapons for some ominous, vaguely ominous reason. But really, the only reason that reason never we don't get a payoff for that reason. Really, all that happens is that we needed all of those weapons to be in the basement of the mansion so that the main characters would realize that the gunpowder down there was about to explode, and they're going to have to jump. And yes, by the way, yes, I know there's a new Homestar Runner Danger-esque video game on Steam. I can't wait to play it. Anyway, but so they can have this big cinematic jumping out the window as the building explodes thing at the end, and it's just aggravating, asinine nonsense like that. So horribly, horribly derivative. Inane nonsense that does not pay off later on in the story, and very poorly developed characters to the point that every single character sounds like a ditzy 20-year-old college girl. So that is far and away the worst novel I've ever read. And like I said, if I cared to reacquaint myself with it 20 years later, I could go into an even greater analysis of it. I don't want to say something. I want to close with something else. When I was in the live stream, I said those were the worst books I'd ever read. And somebody said, are they worse than the Gore novels? Well, here's the thing. And these are the only two Gore novels that I actually own. The others that I read, I downloaded ebook versions, copied the text into a text reader, and listened to them kind of like audiobooks. And that was, let's see, I read Tarnsmen of Gore, Outlaw of Gore, and Priest Kings of Gore, which are the first three. And then, first I read Hunters of Gore, was the first Gore novel I ever read, and or tried to read, and hated it. And read the first three to see what it was all about. And like most people say about the Gore series, the first three are not terrible. And the first book is really not that bad. It's a decent Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of Mars meets Conan the Barbarian kind of knockoff thing. It's not great literature. It's not terrible either. And then after that, it just goes into this horrifically, just heinously, hatefully misogynistic, just horrible world where we follow this character named Tarl Cabot as he goes and becomes he goes through raping and beating and terrorizing and kidnapping and abducting and enslaving and humiliating and beating up women through on and on and on through these books. And he's touted as being the hero, not the hero in spite of doing that, but the hero because he does that. It goes into these agonizingly long philosophical diatribes, and this is coming from someone who loves Ayn Rand. These long philosophical diatribes about man's proper relationship to women and how he thinks that it's noble and heroic to, in his mind, to treat women this way, in this horrible way. And throughout all the books, you just want him to die. You just want him to die. And if you go into that live stream that I did, it's called Jordan Tries Salmon, I think is what it was called. I read a section of one of them it's like how horrible it is. Like, it's not kinky, it's not sexy, it's not fun, it's not fetishistic or cute or anything at all. This guy makes Christian Grey look like someone who works for Amnesty International. I mean, he's horrible. He's vile. I could go on. It's almost indescribable almost inconceivable to think that any human being possessed of any kind of good nature and goodwill could ever present this vile creature to us, and even more so have the gall to call him a hero, not an anti-hero, a genuine bona fide hero. It's beyond disgusting. But here's the thing. Oh, and then I read the first three. I read I believe it's Captive of Gore is the first book that's written by written from a female perspective. Not all of them are from Tarl Cabot's perspective, and some of them are written from the perspective of women who are captured and made slaves and that kind of thing. And so I read one of those, and then I read these, and by that point I was like, okay, I've heard enough. I've heard enough. This is awful. And it never. And from what I understand from talking to Gorians, quote unquote, on the internet, it never gets any better. It never changes. Tarl never gets any better. He only gets worse and worse and more vile and more despicable. Anyway, but here's the thing. even though these books are vile, and understand something, like, you could almost make an excuse for these books if they were just trying to be entertaining trash, but it's not that. It's like the long, deliberate, constant, unceasing explanations for why John Lange, the writer, thinks that it's heroic and noble and virtuous for men to treat women this way. It's literally just, Tarl Cabot is smacking the living shit out of a woman, kicking her in the ground, beating her bloody, and then he turns to you, the viewer, and starts explaining for 20 fucking pages why what he did was wonderful and noble. Despite all of that, despite all of the stuff that just makes you wish Tarl Cabot was real so you could go kill him, all of that, despite all of that, when it comes to things like character development, keeping the character, keeping the character traits of different characters consistent throughout the book, having story elements that are set up at the beginning of the novel that build and build and build until they pay off at the end of the novel, having characters do things that follow logically from what kind of character they are, not introducing inane, irrelevant nonsense that contributes nothing to the actual narrative of the story. And I say this even in light of those long extended philosophical diatribes. At least those support things that are actually going on in the story. When it comes to the components of actually writing literature, those things are there. And that's the thing. As vile as these books are, as disgusting as they are, as much as they make me, like I said, make you wish that Tarl Cabot was real so you could kill him, despite all of that, as far as literature, it's done the way literature is supposed to be done. Characters behave in ways that make sense for their characters. The plot has a clearly structured rising action and climax and falling action, and we go on there's an actual through line plot, and and it's coherent. We understand when people do things, it makes sense why they do them, and things like that. It's like that part. I'll give you an example. In Hunters of Gore, one of the ongoing characters through the Gore novels is a character named Marlanus. And at one point, Marlanus takes what they call a Panther Girl slave as a slave. And, the usual thing, beats the living shit out. And this is Tarl Cabot's bosom buddy, by the way. The usual thing, beats the living shit out of her, enslaves her, and tries to break her under his will. Well, they have the Panther Girls. These are these girls that these gangs of women that live in the woods. They're these kind of Amazonian women that live in all-female tribes in the woods, and they're very much like an analog for. They're very much written as like an analog from a philosophical standpoint for radical feminists and that kind of thing. But anyway, one of these Panther Girls gets captured and she's taken as a slave, and throughout the story, this romantic tension develops between Marlanus and the slave girl he's taken, and she turns by the end of the story, she's proven herself to be this badass warrior and everything, and so at the very end, Marlanus says, take the slave shackles off of this girl. She is no slave. He says, instead, I want to marry this woman and bring her, make her my queen and all of this. And she has this response of, no, I can never be conquered and all of this. And for some reason, I don't think it's ever explained why, but men cry all the time in Gore. And so Marlanus cries and she, departs into the woods unconquered. And, and knowing that his heart will belong to her forever, but for who she and her heart will always belong to him. But they are two different people. People like folks like us don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world, that kind of thing, and they part ways. Okay, so that's one of the subplots in the story. All right, that makes that flow of character development makes logical sense. Like it makes sense that like the person that she is established to be at the beginning of the story pays off logically in how she behaves at the end of the story and throughout the story. And that's the thing I'm talking about. Like when it comes to actual writing, the actual literary merits, at least this is not great fiction. It's not great literature, but at least he can produce the literary equivalent of 2 + 2 = 4. He can at least get from point A to point B to point C to point D, etc., in a logical, reasonable fashion. And I've said also, I've pointed out that if it were not for all of the just unceasing aggressive misogyny in these books, the story, a lot of the plot lines and story ideas that are developed would actually be interesting, like the whole mythology around the priest kings and stuff like that. So there's that's the difference. And to be honest, even that is still only, he's just doing the bare minimum of what's necessary to write decent literature. But compared to these three, it's just all the difference in the world. So hopefully that makes some sense. Anyway, like I said, I want to reiterate again, I don't mean to cast aspersions on Michelle Ismailoff. I know she was a kid when she wrote it. Really, it just comes down to too much attention too soon. She shouldn't have been propped up as some kind of literary super genius with this published book this early on. She should have been sent back to the drawing board and continued her creative writing education. But as it stands, it's just very badly done. So anyway, those are the three worst books I've ever read. Take care.